Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. All right, we're here with former senior intelligence official Artur Wilczynski, and I figured we would talk a little bit about the recently announced inquiry into foreign interference. We now have a process, we now have a judge. And what strikes me is that she has no background in any kind of national intelligence issues. And my question is this going to be a help or a hindrance? Particularly because one of the issues around intelligence is learning how to consume it in an appropriate fashion, particularly when you're looking at a topic like this, where one of the things we're looking at is does the government consume this intelligence appropriately? So, Artur, why don't we get your thoughts about this? What kind of a process this is going to be for her?
So it's going to be a challenging process. I mean, I think it would be silly not to acknowledge that right up front. It's not an easy task that she's accepted to do, and it's, I think, a fundamentally important one. But I'm not that concerned about her lack of specific experience within the national security and intelligence community. I think that there are both advantages and challenges associated with that. In terms of the advantages, I think that it's important to have somebody with a fresh perspective. I think that that not being overly programmed in terms of the minutia of the status quo might actually enable her to come up with some interesting and unique insights into how to make the system better, how to make sure that the right information gets in front of the right people at the right time. I also think that there's a danger, there's a risk in over securitizing and over focusing on the intelligence component of the questions that she needs to answer. Intelligence is a tool that is used to manage and to inform people around the challenges of whatever threat or risk that you're looking at, in this case, foreign interference. But I think that the tools that are necessary to build the resilience in a society need to go far beyond the intelligence community. And that I think somebody with her level of expertise, with her level of administrative law background, she's a smart person with a depth of experience. One doesn't become a member of a provincial court of appeals,
Yeah.
Just like that.
Yeah.
So I have no doubt that she will be able to think through these issues in a broad range. The challenge is she's got a short period of time to do it. So what's really fundamentally important is that she is able to relatively quickly build a team of people around her that maybe do have that insight and experience with national security and intelligence that can help her ask the right questions and make sure that she has access to and insight into all the processes that would help her make an effective series of recommendations that, again, build Canadian resilience.
So part of your past with CSC was about finding ways to better communicate intelligence up the chain and so on. So with that in mind, what kind of a process does she need to go through in order to learn how to read these kinds of documents?
Well, I mean, I think that it depends which documents. I mean, there's a wide range, like not in the Intel community, it's not like just sort of like a single format, single standard. I mean, there are, raw pieces of intelligence, which are unassessed, not analyzed, just direct reporting of, whether it comes through technical sources, through signals intelligence, or if they come through human sources in terms of work of organizations such as CSIS. That those pieces of information, those pieces of the puzzle need to be understood as that she's looking at pieces of a puzzle that then need to be analyzed. So I think that as part of her briefings, and she starts on the 18th, I believe, right? I think part of the process is for her to actually get a broad description of what it is that she's going to look at and what the different pieces of the puzzle actually are in the intelligence process. How does collection work? How does that collection then turn into initial reporting and analysis? How does that then get turned into assessments when judgments are then brought to bear on the information that has been gathered, so that those assessments will then be able to hopefully provide insight to the consumers of intelligence to help them make decisions. So I think that, the actual pieces of information, as long as she understands sort of those basics, and I don't think it's overly complicated to understand that. I think she could then, at least be able to ask some, I think, very insightful questions about how that process works. How does information get from the field, whether, again, it's human collection or technical collection? How does that get turned into information and intelligence product that is then shared with decision makers, whether those decision makers are senior officials, such as the National Security and Intelligence Advisor, or deputy ministers of various ministries? And then how is that information then in turn shared with the Prime Minister, with ministers, and then what do they do with it? So there's a lot of steps along the way, and I think, again, I think personally, it would be a wasted opportunity if she spends all of her time just looking at that. I think that while that's important in terms of the retrospective look at what happened in previous elections, I think an overemphasis on that, again, runs the risk of, I don't know if this is too jargonistic a way of phrasing it, but of securitizing democracy.
Yeah.
Right? It's turning the democratic institutions and enterprise into a function of intelligence and national security, and it's not that. Democracy is supposed to be as broad, as inclusive as there's so many actors that are involved in ensuring that our democratic institutions are effective and resilient to all kinds of stresses. And to focus just on a mechanism around a stream of information, I think is too narrow. That's why I'm glad that her mandate is this kind of bifurcated mandate, right? She's looking retrospectively at what happened in sort of the initial phases, and then being more prescriptive in the second part of her mandate. I think that's good. Again, when I go back to the first thing, it will be remarkably challenging to look at that complexity in as short a time frame as she has. But I just don't see an alternative in terms of a process. We need that kind of review. We need that kind of insight that has the credibility and nonpartisanship that I'm hopeful will characterize the process moving forward, in order to achieve the strategic objective of the entire exercise, which is to rebuild Canadian confidence and the confidence that our citizens have in the integrity and resiliency of our democratic process, so that when folks vote, they know that their vote counts. Anything that doesn't have that as this focus in mind, I think will be counterproductive.
One of the things that kind of strikes me, thinking back to some of what got us to this point, were leaked documents to certain newspapers, and we found out along the way through the David Johnston process that some of these documents that were leaked were drafts, which contained information that were not contained in final documents. And there's some particular relevance around that. And I'm wondering if you can just kind of contextualize that for us from an intelligence perspective, to help us kind of situate where we might see some of this going on in the
so again, it'll all depend on what she asks for. I mean, like her mandate gives her broad scope. So if she wants to look at iterations, for example, of draft reports and see how they have evolved, she can ask for that. Okay. And then she can ask why was something changed or left out or modified in subsequent versions. What was the analysis that was brought to bear on the raw intelligence that, for example, maybe at the end of the day questioned the reliability of a source, question the veracity of what they were saying or their motivations in saying what they said, whether or not there was other information that came into the equation that counteracted the information that maybe came from a single source. This is the problem with that I think too many folks have with intelligence. They don't understand that intelligence is just access to certain types of information. Mm-hmm. and it's a protected, it's a classified way that governments have the legal authority to collect this information in the national interest. But it's a complex process where you have to take all of these different streams of information and then put them in, through a rigorous analytical process, so that at the end of the day, you can provide an assessment or provide a judgment around the likelihood of something, the potential consequences of something, and then leave it up to the policymakers then to make decisions that they feel are in the national interest. That's the thing that I think is intriguing about this entire exercise since the beginning around foreign interference, is that intelligence organizations aren't going to tell you what to do with the information, right? It'll provide information that you have hopefully told collectors and analysts are important for you to have. Mm-hmm. Collectors and analysts then get that information and provide it to policymakers. Policymakers then have to make a choice and make decisions about whether or not that information informs them in a certain way that they can then take a certain decision. But it's not up to organizations like CSE or CSIS to tell whether it's deputy ministers or ministers or the prime minister what to do with that information. He can ask advice from his advisors. He can say, okay, I have this information. What do you think is an appropriate response? And that's where senior officials will provide advice and guidance. But the actual intelligence itself is just is part of the information ecosystem that policymakers need in order to make decisions in the national interest. And I think sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, because we had instances back in the early reporting where they claimed that CSIS was warning certain party officials not to allow certain candidates. And what you're saying here is kind of like not really fitting in with that particular picture that was being painted.
And that would shock me. Like I've worked with CSIS and CSE in various capacities, for many years, and that's never been my experience with any intelligence organization. Mm-hmm. I give you advice and guidance how to adjust their mandates. So, in terms of if you want CSIS to do X, CSIS will say, if you want me to do X, I can't do that right now, given my resources or given my legal parameters, because I'm constrained by the law. Yeah. And one of the things that folks need to understand is that the compliance regime, to make sure that we're lawful, to make sure that we operate within very, very stringent legal and policy parameters, is baked into how intelligence officers and how intelligence analysts think. And something like that, saying, "Hey, I have this one piece. Don't do X," particularly to a political party. Yeah. That just it for me, again, it doesn't pass the sniff test. And if somebody did that, they'd be really operating outside the appropriate scope of the policy and legal constraints that are currently in place.
Yeah, and I do think there's a tendency in media as well to assume that people should be making decisions or telling policymakers what kind of decisions they should be making. The one example I like to think of is around a procurement panel in the military, and they had an expert panel come up with options, and the media kept saying, well, what's your recommendation? And they were like, it's not our job to make the recommendation. Our job was to come up with the options. And so that kind of similar mindset seems to be, I think, on display here as well.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that's interesting, again, in terms of my experience, again, into both as a consumer and as a producer of intelligence, is it's not unheard of that policymakers don't like the information that they've been presented, because to be blunt, sometimes you present policymakers with information, and they're specifically told there's nothing you should or can do about it.
Yeah.
Because we might not, for example, own that information. That information might be from other sources, and there are some serious constraints in what can be done about it. And when policymakers really hate that when you say that to them, well, they say, well, then why did you tell me? I said, well, because you need to know. So that you can understand what is happening. So sometimes intelligence is just part of a basket of information. Again, that goes into that knowledge ecosystem that policymakers have, so that in their own minds, when they're making decisions, they can appropriately contextualize what they know through public information available through journalists and their own meetings that they have with folks. That is complemented by the classified information that is obtained from the covert techniques and methods that intelligence agencies are legally allowed to do. That is shared with them, and sometimes, again, that complexity is not always welcome, but I think that complexity is important. And I think that that's where I think there's work to be done on the part of intelligence organization. This is actually an area where I think it would be really helpful for the justice to talk about, is like, how do you make sure that policymakers who aren't for the most part intelligence experts themselves, how can they be better empowered to use the information in the public interest? I think that's one of the benefits that someone like she brings to this equation, is that she's not already affected by a deep understanding of every single nuance of the intelligence process, and she also doesn't bring an inherent conflict. Right? Some of the justices in the federal courts, for example, have a lot of experience with national security, because it is their job to make decisions around, for example, issuing warrants for CSIS. They are involved in reviews and making decisions around, for example, excesses that maybe the intelligence organizations or where things brought before them.
The frequently cited duty of candor.
Yeah, well, I mean, so and also, I mean, like somebody like the duty of candor is, I think, an interesting kind of concept, right? Like it's an important principle, but bringing a character who has that already established and perhaps even conflictual relationship with certain actors in the national security and intelligence community might impede the nature of the relationship that I think is necessary. So again, I'm hopeful, but I have a ton of empathy for the justice in terms of the scope and scale of the work before her. The other thing that I'd say is that there's nothing stopping her from identifying, okay, the following issues are significant, they're complex. These are the kinds of questions I have about them. I will not have enough time between now and the end, and either the first deadline that she has in February or the second deadline that she has at the end of 2024. But she can still say, I still think the government needs to look at these questions and continue its work on reevaluating them, and put a deadline on when the government needs to come back with options or further elaboration of those issues. There's nothing stopping her from doing that.
That's something I hadn't quite considered. So great. All right. Well, thanks for taking the time to do this, and
anytime.
Got to get in the future.
Yeah, nice chatting. Take care.
And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. It's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And yes, we're still calling it Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.